Ich darf Sie heute Abend wieder hier im Kreisky-Forum begrüßen und ich darf mir auch erlauben, Deutsch zu sprechen, weil mein Gast Colin Crouch Deutsch spricht. Das ist also gut für mich, dass ich Deutsch sprechen kann zur Einleitung und insbesondere gut für Sie. Das können Sie mir glauben. Das ist eine Premiere. Das ist eine Premiere heute. Nämlich, wir machen seit, glaube ich, 5 Jahren diese Reihe Genial dagegen im Kreisky-Forum und das ist der erste Gast, Colin Crouch, der ein zweites Mal hier ist. Und in Wirklichkeit ist er ein drittes Mal hier, weil er ja auch zu Gast war bei der großen Genial dagegen-Konferenz im Oktober. Was würde Bruno Kreisky heute sagen? Das heißt, ich kann sagen, Colin Crouch, es freut mich, dass Sie wieder hier sind. Quasi schon ein Stammgast im Kreisky-Forum und das freut uns besonders. Zu Colin Crouch muss ich deswegen auch ganz wenig nur sagen. Zur Einleitung, viele von Ihnen kennen ihn wohl und viele haben ihn vielleicht auch hier schon im Laufe der vergangenen 2,5 Jahre gesehen. Colin Crouch ist vor 2-3 Jahren mit diesem kleinen Büchlein Postdemokratie, insbesondere auch hier in unserem deutschsprachigen Raum, eingeschlagen, kann ich sagen. Es ist eines sicher der meist rezipierten politikwissenschaftlichen Bücher der letzten 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Jahren. Es wurde ein Bestseller, habe ich mir sagen lassen, im deutschsprachigen Raum insbesondere. Also die deutsche Ausgabe hat mehr verkauft als die britische. Also die Briten haben noch nicht ganz begriffen, so viel, dass es wir Österreicher, wir hier im deutschsprachigen Raum wissen, dass wir ein Problem haben mit unserer Demokratie. Ist ja auch schwer zu übersehen. Woanders ist vielleicht dieses Bewusstsein noch nicht so da. Ich meine, es hat ja selten was voraus. In dem Fall ist es vielleicht so. Im vergangenen Jahr, in dem vergangenen Herbst hat er dann dieses Buch vorgelegt, Colin Crouch, das befremdliche Überleben des Neoliberalismus, indem er viele der Fragen, die in Postdemokratie angeschnitten sind, noch weiter ausführt und insbesondere auch ausführt vor dem Hintergrund der tiefen ökonomischen Krise, die wir durchmachen seit dem Herbst 2008, dem Zusammenbruch von Lehman Brothers und allen Schockwellen, die bis jetzt noch durch die Welt gehen. Ich kann Ihnen also diese beiden Bücher, die sind draußen zu erstehen, im Anschluss auch sehr ans Herz legen und, das sage ich auch dazu, Colin Crouch ist natürlich auch vertreten in unserem Buch Genial dagegen, die Reihe, die wir, sozusagen die erste Zusammenfassung der ersten, weiß ich nicht, 40 Abenden, die wir hier hatten, da er hier schon einmal zu Gast war. Also auch hier ist Colin Crouch mit einem Essay vertreten. Alle diese Bücher können Sie draußen dann erstehen. Colin Crouch, ich höre gleich auf. Ich danke Ihnen, dass Sie wieder hier sind und the floor is yours.
Herzlichen Dank, Robert. I've been asked to speak in English because it's said that some people here might not be German speakers. It's probably also because listening to my German for more than about 5 minutes can be very painful. It's rather sad the way English is becoming the only language of intellectual communication in the world, actually. When we think in the 12th century, Dante wrote his Divine Comedy in Italian in order to prove that you did not need Latin in order to express complex ideas. But now that has all been forgotten, and we think that we can only say things in English unless we're saying Grüß Gott und Auf Wiedersehen. That's a bisschen there. I'm talking today about this new book I've written, which it has a title in English, which is somewhat different from the German and soon-to-be Italian titles. In English, it's called The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. And that makes sense for some people in Britain, because it is an echo of a title of a famous book written in the 1920s by a man called Dangerfield, called The Strange Death of English Liberalism. And it was about how the Liberal Party the peak of its triumph of dominance over British politics at the beginning of the 20th century, then collapsed completely. So it was about the strange death of English liberalism. Now, I'm writing about neoliberalism rather than liberalism, and I'm not writing about an English phenomenon, so there's no adjectives, it's just neoliberalism. But what I'm writing about is not the strange death of neoliberalism, but the refusal of it to die, or as the German translation gives it, the strange survival. I called it non-death in English in order to get this echo with Dangerfield's book. I originally wanted to call it the strange undeath, but that would put it among books about vampires, so I said non-death. Now, what do I mean by the strange non-death of neoliberalism? I'm referring to the fact that neoliberalism as a governing hegemonic ideology, having reached a major, massive crisis in 2008, has actually emerged from that more powerful than before. And how do we explain this? And it's even more interesting because if we look back at the period now since the end of the Second World War, there have been two major hegemonic periods of economic thinking, both of which have lasted 30 years, both of which have ended in a crisis. In one, it was almost a death, and in the second one, it has been the opposite of a death. The two periods are, of course, the Keynesian period and then the neoliberal period. Keynesian demand management, as you will all know, was a strategy that said that governments needed to steer economies by using their own debt and their own spending in order to get a balance between inflation and full employment. It was never a policy for chronic debt. It was a strategy for the careful use of state debt at certain moments. And it also came along with ideas legitimating the role of the state as a general steering mechanism for the economy. It was never completely dominant as a set of ideas, and it was important in Britain, it was important in the Scandinavian countries, it was important in Austria, in a somewhat different form in France and Italy, occasionally in the United States, never really until the late 60s in Germany. But it was a kind of international set of ideas. It was seen to have collapsed in the inflationary crises of the 1970s when governments seemed unable to come out of the inflationary stage of the Keynesian mechanism. And it was deemed, therefore, to have failed. And we were told it was replaced by something that was called monetarism. And monetarism placed all stress on the need to restrict the supply of money. In other words, the priority of economic policy should be to stop inflation, and it was the job of the labour market to adapt to that. If people didn't want unemployment, then they had to accept the consequences of reducing wages, and they couldn't use inflation. Now, actually, looking back over the neoliberal period, the period of monetarism, it wasn't, in fact, based on an end to debt at all. What there was instead was a shift from public debt to private debt. Because it was clear by the beginning of this century, really, that the American and to some extent the British, the Irish, some other economies were depending on people maintaining their consumption through taking on enormous personal debt. Normally, the great bulk of personal debt is held by relatively wealthy people, certainly by the top 50% of the income distribution. What became strange during the 1990s and into the beginning of this century was the holding of large quantities of debt by people in the bottom 40% of the income distribution. It was in 2005, the OECD started to get interested in this, and they started to collect statistics on who was holding debt. And there were only a few countries could provide them with statistics, actually. There was Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Denmark, Sweden, Spain, small number, and the Netherlands. And you could see from that in some countries, including Denmark actually, the relatively poor people were starting to get dependent on debt. Debt raised primarily on the houses that they owned. People would take on mortgages, new mortgages on their houses, mortgages of more than 100% of the value of the house, not in order to buy property, but to fund consumption spending. And also credit card debt. The same countries, Britain, the United States, to some extent Denmark, Ireland, are the countries where credit card debt remains at very, very high levels. So actually what we were told was a tight monetary regime wasn't. Instead, the great growth, what looked like the great success of the Anglo-American and some other economies during the 1990s and the beginning of this century wasn't actually based on tough monetary regime that finally produced an entrepreneurial economy. It was based on massive private debt. And I've called this period one of privatized Keynesianism, because the debt was privatized. Now, eventually, it collapsed, as we know, because we know that this debt model was only sustained by banks trading completely irresponsibly, by banks trading in assets where they had no idea of what it was they were trading. They were selling each other bundles of assets, and they had never looked into them to discover that a large part of it was made up of mortgage debt that was never going to be repaid. Eventually, of course, it came out, and there was an enormous loss of confidence, and the consequences are still with us. Now, Keynesianism had its inflationary crisis in the mid-1970s and declined considerably as a model. It's never been completely lost. Governments still use demand management. But it's certainly declined as an overall hegemonic set of ideas. But neoliberalism, as I say, after its collapse, has actually not gone into decline and has not been replaced by any other model. And to explain this, we need to look at actually ideas that you'll find in Karl Marx. I'm not actually a Marxist, never have been, but there's some very valuable ideas in Marx. And he had that central idea that at any period of history, a particular class managed to stand for the interests of the whole society. And he thought eventually, of course, the working class would be this class, and that would then be the end, because there was nothing beyond the proletariat, and that's where he went completely wrong. But we can say, in a sense, in the years after the Second World War, the manual working class of industrial society did reach a kind of position where its interests seemed to be the interests of everybody. Partly because it was a class that had threatened to be politically very dangerous in the first half of the 20th century. Its insecurity in unregulated labour markets made it potentially rebellious and revolutionary. And also, though, its consumption was needed in order to keep the economy going. Previously in history, economies had never been based on mass consumption. Ordinary people just had enough to survive, sometimes not that. And any real expansion of economic activity took place in luxury goods. It starts to change towards the end of the 19th century in a small way, but it's really only from the middle of the 20th century that we get economies based on mass consumption. And this was because working class living standards were stabilized, and part of that was to do with Keynesian demand management. Now, the 1970s saw not just the crisis of the Keynesian model in the middle of the inflationary crises caused by various commodity rises. It also saw, in most countries of the Western world, the beginning of a major decline of the size of the industrial working class. You can see the figures. It begins in some countries in the 60s, and by the 70s it's gone virtually everywhere in the West, that the proportion of the workforce that is working in manual industrial work starts to decline and is replaced by a whole series of services activities, the Dienstleistungen sector of the economy, whose workforce has not had anything like the political organization and the potential threat to social stability that was once threatened by the working class. So the decline of the Keynesian model also goes alongside the decline of the class that carried it. If we look at what's happened to the neoliberal model, exactly the opposite has happened. The class of very wealthy investors and of senior managers of major enterprises, especially in the banking sector, has not suffered an historical decline at this moment. In fact, the last 20 years have been characterized in most countries by a gradual shift of more and more wealth and income to the very top small percentage, 1%, even less than 1% of the distribution. Also, there has been, for the first time for many decades, a shift in the share of profits and labour in national income against the interests of labour. That we can see in the statistics. There is no crisis for what we might still call a capitalist class. And more than that, the way in which the crisis has worked out has demonstrated something that we probably already knew, and that was that we are actually all dependent. We've built ourselves an economy, at least we have in the Anglo-American world, we have built ourselves an economy that is heavily dependent on the activity of investment banking. That famous phrase about banks being too big to fail in the crisis meant that these were firms that were now outside a pure market economy, that they were politically important, socially important. And so the crisis, it might have revealed the misbehavior of the banks, but it also revealed that we'd all become dependent on that misbehavior. So I'm not saying the banks have become parasitical. And this is a problem. It'd be all right if they were parasitical. We could say, right, out. But actually, we all shared in the sin, or at least those of us in countries that benefited from this system did. We all thought we were growing wealthier, and actually it was because of this speculative activity. And so coming out of that is extremely difficult and painful. And governments are very tempted to say, what we really want is for that financial model to get going again, because they were good years. Well, the Germans might not agree, but the British and the Americans do think that. Further, but even more than that, of course, that the financial sector has made because it's become so central to the economic model, its personnel are fundamental to the political system. It's very interesting if you look at the Obama administration, which was came into office in the US hoping to clean up and tame the financial sector. It is itself dependent on individuals who came from the banking sector and who will go back to that sector after they've finished their term in office, exactly as had happened with the Bush administration. People came in from Goldman Sachs, worked in the Bush administration, deregulated the financial system so that nice profits could be made for people like Goldman Sachs, and then went back to work in Goldman Sachs. And this is not called corruption, this is just legitimate politics. And it's interesting that the new prime ministers of both Greece and Italy have in the past worked for Goldman Sachs. And the banking sector has interpenetrated the political world with personnel as well as with ideas and as well with our dependence on it. Now, of course, we are seeing moves towards a regulation of the financial sector, and the British government, which is very heavily involved in the economy of what we call the City of London, has passed legislation with quite a tough regulatory regime. But this system will come into force in the year 2019, by which time there will have been at least one general election in Britain. Everyone will have forgotten it, and the banks will have had 10 years or 9 years in which to lobby to get it weakened. So the neoliberal model is not in a crisis. Well, the model's in a crisis, but it's not in danger of being displaced because, to use an American phrase, it's the only show in town, and it has means of ensuring that's the case. Now, interesting question that comes from that is the financial sector a special case, or is it in some ways typical of something wider? In many ways, it is a special case, actually, and if one of the criticisms you could make of my new little book is that I really don't make enough of that. I think, generalize too much from the financial sector. It is a special case because finance is the blood of the economy. Right? Also, enterprises in other sectors can turn themselves into financial enterprises. You can have a financial wing of almost any corporation. So finance and banking are different. But it's a special case, but it is also an indicator of something more general that has happened, which is a kind of, you could see it as a direct consequence of the neoliberal turn. But it ends up, paradoxically, as something that is deeply hostile to some of the main beliefs of neoliberals themselves, or at least of neoclassical economists. What I mean by that is that a very important part of neoliberal ideas is that there really should be a separation between the economy and the polity. And the whole critique of Keynesianism was based on that critique of government intervention. And certainly if you look into any neoclassical theory, you see that government playing only a very, very limited role of sort of guaranteeing the currency, guaranteeing the law of property, guaranteeing quite a few things actually, but basically government is separate from economic interests. And certainly, if we go back as far as Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, one of the things that most concerned him was when politicians and businessmen were too close together. And he wanted to say, he saw that as a source of corruption, of monopoly, of exclusive activities, and he wanted to get that separation of the market away from political interference. So it's fundamental to any idea of economic liberalism that there should be separation of economic and political power. And that there's no way of producing a liberal economic theory that does not include that. And yet, in practice, the neoliberal period has brought us an extraordinary concentration of links between political and economic power. I've mentioned already this with the case of the banks, but one sees it in other sectors. And we can trace back, if you're tracing it back in terms of economic ideas, there was a change in the United States in the 1970s. It all happens then. A change in ideas about what competition meant. The historical US legal economic model of what they call antitrust legislation, anti-monopoly legislation, anti-cartel legislation. The heart of that was that there must be a large number of competing firms continuing over time. That a competitive economy meant a large number of competitors. Partly to give consumers choice, but there was always a political idea in it too. And that if you've got a large number of competing firms, none of them can ever actually get political power. They'll be too busy earning their living in the market, they'll be competing with each other, they won't be able to get political power. And something extremely similar comes out of the development of the German ordoliberal school at the very end of the Second World War, when the idea was to build an economy based on a strong Mittelstand, the kleiner und mittlerer Betrieb, to avoid large concentrations of capital, because they had analyzed that if you get large concentrations of capital, you also get large concentrations of an aggressive working class, and you end up with either Hitler or Stalin, or probably both in different parts of the world. So the analysis of ordoliberalismus was, again, you must have a competitive economy, and a competitive economy meant competition went on and on and on. The permanent state of the economy should be a large amount of competition. And both in the US and in German and then eventually European competition law was this idea that you had to break up big concentrations, that large corporations should not be allowed to eliminate their competitors. And a change took place in American law and economics theories. It actually comes out of lawyers more than economists, interestingly. They had a law and economics school which said no. And in a way, one has to be honest and admit, their starting point was a big problem that was appearing, and that is that in several sectors of the modern economy, there were very strong trends to concentration. Motor cars, for example, and clear gains to efficiency coming from concentration. Also banks, because until recent decades, American banks have not been allowed to concentrate. They were restricted in their size. And this was holding back efficiency, and antitrust legislators were having to go further and further interfering into the structure of firms in order to assert the classical model. So there is a real problem that's emerging in the background. But the analysis that the law and economics school made was to say, competition doesn't mean competition going on and on and on. Competition means someone wins. And that's the end of the competition. Right? So a competitive economy is an economy in which the most successful smash the little ones. And you end up with a relatively small number of firms. Once you get, they say, to 3 firms, it's probably monopoly. But as long as you've got a few firms, you don't actually want to break down concentrations. And this was politically very influential at the time in the US, partly because of anti-state ideas being very dominant, but also it's when the Americans were really worried about German and Japanese competition. And so the corporations were going to government saying, look, it's our antitrust legislation that's holding us back. You've got to let our firms become bigger if they're going to compete in the world. And then an ideological background to that was provided by the Law and Economics School. So you've got this change in American antitrust. It's never been completely victorious. Antitrust goes on, and so, for example, Microsoft have their problems. They've had more problems with the European court than with the US courts, but Microsoft and the other big monopolies in the US do have problems. But there have been considerable victory for the idea that competition is about an outcome of a process. It's not a continuing process. And you can have a lot of debate about the economics of that, about whether increasing size always means increasing efficiency. And there are very interesting technical arguments about that. But one thing always gets forgotten in these arguments, and that was that both in the United States and in Germany and the rest of Europe, the argument about a competitive economy was not just about economic efficiency and consumer choice, it was also about the consequences and the dangers of a political use of concentrated economic power. And that there are no arguments about. And if you talk to the Chicago law and economics people, they will say, well, if you get government out of businesses' hair, you get the government out of the economy, no one's got any incentive to use political power because government can't do anything about the economy. And that's the only argument they have. And we know that that isn't adequate, because these same decades that have seen the triumph of these ideas and which have seen the decline of any powerful political critique of the role of business has seen this enormous growth of lobbying and something that goes beyond lobbying, the interpenetration of personnel between business and government, that we see in the most extreme form in the United States, but you will find it almost everywhere in the advanced economies now. And so neoliberalism has given us a kind of politicized set of giant corporations who are able to use, certainly in US law, are able to use liberal arguments about the freedom to use your property as you like in order to produce a kind of penetration of political power by business that is counter to all the ideas of economic liberalism that there have ever been. And this is the contradiction that is at the heart of modern neoliberalism. It's in a way, just as we used to talk about actually real existing socialism in Eastern Europe, there's real existing neoliberalism. Doesn't have much to do with the ideas of neoclassical economics. There's another development which has been part of the same neoliberal package, which has had similar consequences, though here for totally different reasons. Another important part of neoliberalism has been the need to break up the state and its monopolies, and the need to privatize as much of what in the past we called öffentlicher Dienst, public service, as possible. If you notice, the term public service is no longer used in Brussels speak. There are things called services of general interest. But the phrase public services disappeared from European vocabulary. And that's because of a strong pressure to say, if we're building a liberal economy, we must have private firms competing, not just in the provision of gas and electricity and water. I've never worked out how anyone ever competes for the supply of water. We have privatized water supply in the United Kingdom, but only one firm can take water out of a river, actually. And so that's never competitive. But gas and electricity, telecommunications can be competitive. But not only that, but also schools, hospitals, care services. A very strong pressure to privatize these. In some cases, these have been more or less successful, where you actually can get competition. Seems to me there's no reason why anyone should object to, say, 8 or 9 electricity companies providing a city with its electricity. We might argue that actually they compete in dishonest ways, but one can't make a fundamental objection to that on liberal or social democratic grounds. But when we come to the privatization of the welfare state, we run into a really interesting paradox. These privatizations do not take the form of putting these things in the pure market. Because the historical triumph of social democracy was so strong that outside the United States, people view with horror the idea that you should not receive health care as a citizen's right. And the government that tries to destroy that runs into enormous difficulties. The same with schools, the same with many aspects of care and some other public services. Very strong beliefs that these are citizenship rights, which means that when these are privatized, the supply is privatized, but the demand is not. And so what you get, for example, we have this in Britain now, and you have it, and I'll say a bit more about this in a minute, you have it particularly strongly in Scandinavia. You get firms will bid for contracts to run the schools or the health service or the old people's care service in a particular city or region of a country. So and there's usually a very small number of corporations who are in the market for competing for this business. In general, they are specialists in the task of running public services. And in Britain, we have firms that started off in road construction and now are running nursery schools. The expertise, their expertise is not the actual service. Their expertise is how to win contracts out of government officials. which is not the same as winning contracts in the market. And also, the customers of the service are not the users. The customer is the person who pays the bill. And because of the triumph of social democracy, because we insist these things are funded by the state and received free or heavily subsidized at the point of use, it's government that pays the bill. And this is very nice business for corporations, actually. It's something the American corporations are only slowly beginning to realize. You get quite a soft marketplace for bidding for contracts. There's a small number of firms out there with you, and you get to know the government officials, and you try and get contracts from them. And you don't have to go out and find customer users. You just have this one big fat customer that pays everybody's bill. And this, and of course now, it looks as though what's being contracted out is just the provision of a service. So following the theory of contract, you have a principal and an agent, and in theory, the principal, that is the government department, says, we want this, we want schools to do this, we want schools to do that, we want hospitals to do this, and all that the agent does is to fulfill that mandate. And that's the rule of contract making. But we know from the world of private contracts that that doesn't work and can't work. That any complex contract, especially for a service, there has to be interaction between the two sides. So if we take an example from what could be a private sector, we could say a firm that uses a lot of trucks might go to a truck building firm and say, we want some trucks, we've got some very special needs, here's what we want, right? So they're the principal, they say, these are the trucks we want, you just go away and make it. But what really happens is the building firm, the firm building the trucks comes back to the contractor and says, well, look, you said you wanted this, but actually, we don't think that's such a good idea. We think it'd be better for you, and better for us, if you did it slightly differently. And then, oh yeah, all right, we'll do it differently. So, in fact, the agent in a principal-agent relationship usually gets involved actually in determining what goes into the contract, as well as how it's carried out. It's very, very difficult to carry out any complex task without that. That also happens when private firms deliver public services. That in theory, the policy is being made by the public authority. All the firm does is provide it. But actually, of course, it's impossible to do it that way. They come back and they say, it would be better if you did it some other way. So actually, firms come into public policy making. I said we are seeing this particularly strongly in the Nordic countries. And it occurred to me just about 3 weeks ago I had this thought, so it's not in my book. Maybe this is the new social compromise. We can keep our welfare state if private firms can have very soft contracts providing it for us. That seems to be what's happening in Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries. Actually, in a small way, it was the outcome of Obama's healthcare bill, because the only way he got it through in the end was something that said, well, and actually private firms will be the providers. That was the crucial thing that he had to concede to get that through. But maybe that's the new social compromise, and we have to think, is that as good as it gets in the 21st century? Is it the only way we save the welfare state? Certainly, it means a model where, again, corporations have entered the world of the polity. This is not Adam Smith's image of a liberal economy. So this is why I argue that we are increasingly having an economy that is not one where the old struggle, as we always have talked about, for the last century or 150 years, a struggle between state and market. It's a triangular, it's a dyad of state, market, and corporation. And these come together in different configurations. Sometimes you get the classic confrontation of state versus market and where the corporation is just how the market appears. But you sometimes might find actually states and corporations conspiring together against the market, as is the case in a number of these contract examples. Or I wonder, do you get the market and you get all the possible configurations are there, it's not. And it's an economy. It's a model in which the corporations have a political role, and it's not a model of an economy that will be found in any textbook or ever put forward as a desirable model by anyone. That people will usually deny that it exists rather than defend it as a model. And this seems to me to be the world in which we are moving. Against all this, because so far this is a picture of growing domination of politicized corporations, of an increasingly detached, wealthy elite in a close relationship with a political class, right, bearing down on the rest of us. But that isn't the whole story of modern societies. Modern people, early 20th century people, and late 20th century people, are a rather difficult lot. We're not easily governed. We are unruly, we protest, we complain, we demand transparency, we get angry when we learn about corruption, and we join all sorts of campaigns about it. We're not regierbar. We're not easily governable. And there is therefore a kind of tension between these are two. It's a relatively peaceful confrontation, that, as the history of social confrontation goes. It's pretty peaceful so far. But it is quite tense because you've got very sharply opposed forces there. It's depended for a fairly untroubled survival on the fact that the general public hasn't really noticed this new concentration of political and economic power. But this is changing. Following the banking crisis, there's been an enormous interest shown by ordinary people, and also a very critical interest on the part of conservative newspapers in the way in which the earnings of senior management executives in banking and in most other sectors continues to go up and up, even when the shares go down in their companies and the business that their firms are doing goes down. That they seem to be in a separate world from the rest of us. People are noticing it now. People are also noticing the lobbying power of business much more than they used to. And I say that the term lobbying actually underestimates what goes on because it's a much deeper penetration of government than the term lobbying implies. But people are noticing this now and are starting to get angry about it. They don't think it's right that Goldman Sachs seems to dominate every government. They don't think it's right that lobbyists, and recently in Britain it was discovered that almost half the passes to work in the Houses of Parliament in London are actually possessed by lobbyists from corporations, so that the Parliament gradually becomes a place where lobbyists are. And some of you may have been at the talk I gave earlier this afternoon, in which case I apologise. Well, most of this you've heard already, so I'm very sorry in general, but very sorry in particular for this little story that I told, which is a peculiar little story. Last week, the Prime Minister of Britain bought a field, piece of land, for not a very large sum of money, actually. Normally, no one would have noticed or bothered to mention in any newspaper at all that the Prime Minister had bought a field for a few £100,000. But it was a news story because he bought it from someone called a lobbyist, a corporate lobbyist. And they think he got it cheap. What was the lobby? Why was the lobbyist selling him this field so cheap? What is he getting out of government? Now, a year ago, 8 months ago, 6 months ago, no one would have noticed that story. No one would have seen anything in it. But it was immediately pounced on. So there is an awareness. In a way, the kind of curtain that concealed all the complicated doings of the financial sector and the corporate sector from the rest of us has come down, at least temporarily. Danger is people forget all these things. And so that confrontation between a politicized and rather arrogant corporate elite and a rather awkward, difficult, questioning, complaining public is actually beginning to get interesting. The most visible sign of it, of course, is, and it predates, it's a development that's been happening for some years now, the growth of a whole series of campaigns, things you call in German Bürgerinitiativen, for which there isn't really any English language equivalent. The growing importance of that across a whole series of issues. And it had a big surge earlier on with the initial rise of the Green movement in the 1980s. But it's back again now. It's not, and although these campaigns are often very small, very weak, they're like butterflies, they last a few days and then they die. The fact that it has never really gone away since the 1980s, and that people are more are inclined to join groups and support groups who are protesting and complaining, usually about the behavior of large corporations, is the most visible expression of this wider dissatisfaction that there is with the power of the corporate elite. And so what I said was a triangle of state, corporation and market is actually a viereck. It's a quadrilateral, because we also have this civil society as a very weak, but existing extra part of it. So this gives us a politics, and in particular an economic politics for the future, which is interesting and in some ways novel. What I'm particularly concerned to get people to do is to look beyond the market and state division. There was that famous German social democratic slogan in after the Bad Godesberg period, I suppose, when they said, wie viel Markt wie möglich, wie viel Staat wie nötig. Now, I don't believe any social democrat really believed it was that way around, actually, but never, it was an interesting slogan, right? As much market as possible, as much state as necessary. Now, in a way, there is the formulation I would offer in addition to that one is, wie viel Zivilgesellschaft wie möglich, wie viel große Konzerne wie nötig. We can't do away with the great corporations. It's impossible to envisage going back to the kind of economy of small and medium-sized enterprises that the Ordoliberalen and the American economic thinkers envisaged in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. You can't, in too many sectors, we just do need giant size in order to give us the products and the services that we all love using. So you're not going to get rid of that. You might reduce it in various ways. You're not going to get rid of it. But what we can have is a civil society that is constantly criticizing and questioning and criticizing not just state power, but also market power. And in that way, we have a politics that is at least lively. My book reads to people as a pessimistic book, and is technically, I suppose, a dystopia. You know, a dystopia is the opposite of a utopia. It describes a world that would be bad, and what you're really saying to people is, look, that's the direction you're heading in. Do you really want that? And obviously the author is always hoping that if enough people say this kind of thing, people will actually do something about it. One must never be fatalistic and say, that's the way it's going to get, there's nothing we can do. As I think I said, actually most of what I've said here, I said when I was here last month, you should never invite someone back twice in a month. But one thing I remember saying then was, only the extreme right can risk being pessimistic. If you start getting pessimistic and saying the world is bad and it's going to get worse and there's nothing we can do, you end up on the extreme right politically. And so that's happened to some, so there's notable thinkers over the years that has happened to. So you must always look for where you can do something, where you can act. And we find it.
in lively civil society. We find it in the discontent with this model of corporate political power. Because the fact that the ideological justification of neoliberalism is based on the importance of separating economic power from political power, but it's actually given us their coming together in a model that no one ever defends. That is a vulnerability of that system. And there's room there for critics to work and to work on public opinion. And so, although I give a gloomy message, and although I say of my Viereck, the civil society point is the weakest point, it's there. And we don't want to make it weaker by talking about how weak it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, for this wonderful, optimistic lecture. We have to use, it's usual here that I ask the first 2 or 3 questions to our guest, and then the audience can go on. My first question would be, it's very convincing, your model, that there is neoliberalism as a theory and real existing neoliberalism as the praxis, and the praxis was all the time was dominant, and it was far away from theory. That the theory was about free markets and competition, and the praxis was about using state power and market power for robbery, to put it bluntly. It reminds me also to what James Kenneth Galbraith, who also was here, said in his book about the predator state, where he said, he put it in another way, in a chronological way, saying that with the Reagan guys in 1970s, 80s, he as a Keynesian intellectual could quarrel because they had an idea and they had an intellectual aim. With the Bush guys and the later on guys, there was no discussion because they already realized the theory won't work, so the only thing we want is robbery out the state. My question is, but now the question is, this is convincing for sure, but does this ideological formation, which wants to dominate in the praxis, doesn't it need a legitimizing theory? So if the legitimizing theory went bankrupt, what does this mean to the praxis? Or is the praxis today already totally independent from that? That would be the first question.
Okay, would be, is the first question.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think the model is still in difficulties. Is this?
Yeah, it works.
It's not absolutely triumphant and dominant, and I think the people who represent the large corporations and the banks are certainly worried so they are dominant because they have a power. They know we're dependent on them, but they are taking some risks with public opinion, in my view. You see, historically, elites that have accepted democracy have been able to do so because they had about the top sort of 50% of the income distribution was more likely to identify with the elite than with the working class, because it had some property it wanted to defend, and the working class was seen as dangerous. And it was only when elites realized they could forge alliances with that large Mittelstand that they were willing to accept democracy. Where they didn't see the scope for that alliance, they didn't have democracy. Now, it seems to me one of the things that's happening at the moment is that the elite is cutting itself off from that Mittelstand. It's partly there is no longer there's no longer the threat of a revolutionary class to make people feel insecure against those below, and so the middle-class people can afford to be critical of the elite. And the elite sees itself as so distanced, partly because it's globalized itself, that it's not a nationally rooted elite anymore. It lives wherever it likes across the globe. And I think it is taking risks, actually. Yeah, and I don't think it feels that comfortable. So that's why I say we're living in times that are not of an unchallenged hegemony at all.
My last question for this sequence would be, your model with this triangle, market, government, corporations on the one hand, and the civil society on the other hand, my impression is political parties don't play a role in this model, or they play a role in the model where they have no possible role as a solution. Because that is my impression from your lecture and also from your book, because they are part already of this corrupt corporational governmental complex. That's the one thing. One can go as far to say they are already bought, and in some cases and in some places they are obviously bought. The other thing is that on the other hand, you have your optimistic idea about this civil society, that this is the lively place. So many people from the civil society, Bürgerinitiativen, NGOs, they would not say, is my impression, that they say, okay, our place is the very lively place and we are happy with that, and this whole other political system we ignore. They actually say, yes, we are a lively place and we are in bad mood that the political system is in such a bad shape. And they don't think we ignore parties. They think, I would be glad if there are political forces in the normal political life which can represent our ideas, our energy. So do you have, because you were so a little bit optimistic at the end of a lecture, do you think there is a possibility to put some life back in the normal political process?
Yes. The parties have been captured, yes, by corporate elites, but only partly captured. They're not totally captured. And there continue to be people coming up through parties of all kinds, actually, not just on the left, who are worried about these trends and want to fight for something different. Also, parties have to respond to voters, and the voters do not come from the elite, and they have demands for schools and hospitals and pensions that have to be listened to. So it's, in my book, when I talk about parties at the end, I see them as really working between the state system and civil society. Their fundamental importance is that they bridge that gap. So if you do a thought experiment and say, let's imagine a party system which is completely cut off from civil society. It doesn't talk to civil society doesn't want to talk to it. It lives in a world of its own, in a little house of political power and contracts and place and position. That is a very unattractive prospect. And people in the social movements who say, let's forget the parties, must realize that they are actually wishing, in fact, that system of parties, a totally self-referential system. And one of the things wrong with the Italian political system at the national level, not the local level, is that it almost does perfectly correspond to that, actually. Also, so the parties, and so if you do that thought experiment, you say, no, I don't want that. Well, that means
if you're someone in a party, you don't want to be cut off from the society. If you're someone in a civil action group, you shouldn't want to be cut off from the parties. So you need groups that work between the state system and civil society. And parties do that, and it will always be, and in my view ought to be, a tense and difficult relationship. As again, going back to this talk I gave in the Berggasse earlier on this afternoon on the question of whether social democracy and civil society were Gegner or active partners, and they ought to, they are both, and they should remain both, because, well, for a number of reasons why, but I'll just give one reason, a major reason now. And that is, parties need to renew themselves from society. They need ideas, they need themes, they need to know about new social interests. And they can't do this for themselves because they are in a position of almost permanent preparation for election campaigns. Parties can very rarely take risks with issues. So if you think of an enterprise, if you think of the economy, firms, we only get new products, new ideas, new services when entrepreneurs try out ideas. Oh, let's see if we can sell this. Let's see if we can sell that. A lot of these fail, and they just disappear. And some succeed, and they're the things that we have and we buy. It's very difficult to do that model in the economy, in the polity. Politics needs new ideas just as the economy does, but a firm whose ideas fail doesn't bear the consequences for that failure for the future. Whereas parties, being in this constant electoral competition, whenever they take up an idea that's unpopular or something that turns out to be wrong-headed, the burden of that stays with them for years. And that's why they are risk-averse. The political governments and parties are risk-averse. And so they can't be policy entrepreneurs. But they need people who are policy entrepreneurs. And so from looking at from the point of view of a civil society actor, this seems very cruel. But parties should be looking at what's going on in civil society. They should see which campaigns have really caught public opinion, and they should then follow those and develop them. And the ones that don't seem to be working, they just keep distance. Now, that actually is a tense relationship between party and civil society. They're constantly disliking each other, but it's probably in all of our interests that they do that.
Thank you. Now I would shut up and give you the opportunity to ask some questions. Ja, Sie gleich und Sie dann. Da habe ich jetzt einige Zeichen. Bitte, da hinten waren einige Zeichen, die muss ich erstmal. Ja.
Es gibt viel. Zwei dort.
Ja. Okay, ich glaube, ich habe es jetzt. Also als erstes Sie.
I'm referring to the part where you quoted Karl Marx and his idea that at certain points in history, a certain class embodies everything that's wrong with the economic system and becomes the leading force in economic and social change. And what you said about the working class having this role after the Second World War, etc. Which class could, in your opinion, be the one leading the next change? And I might already propose a certain group, those precariously employed, because they are the ones most affected by the crisis and everything that's wrong with neoliberalism. What do you have to say about that? Thank you.
Shall I answer one after the other, or should I take a group?
Yeah.
What
do you prefer?
Take that one as a good question.
Okay. Okay.
It means if I take a group, I think they're bad questions. The problem with the precarious is that it's difficult to see them carrying a social model, unless it is that of precariousness. Because the working class, what they carried was the need for a system that provided, through public policy, a level of security and basic needs through public services, and an economic environment in which their income seemed secure. even into old age. It's difficult to see what the precarious offer, other than a desire not to be precarious, in which case they want to be assimilated to the rest. And I think a very important thing for social policy in the coming years is working on ways in which we can abolish the condition of precariousness. But I'd be surprised if that was a complete model. Well, if we look into the future, we have to remember that globally, the industrial working class is probably bigger now than it has ever been in history. So I suspect at some point, and I don't know when it will be, I suspect it will be the dissatisfaction of the Chinese and other Far Eastern working classes that will actually force a new model on the world. Thinking at home, thinking within the advanced world, I suppose something which has already developed a long way, but I just wonder, have we seen everything that feminism has to offer the world yet? And the position, because women are very important among the workers in the new sectors of the economy, both among the precarious and also among the public service professionals, care workers and others. And women, industrial society was very much defined on a male basis of a working world that was concerned with public life and a domestic sphere that was withdrawn from public life. And the gender balance meant that men existed in the public sphere and women existed in the private sphere, which was mainly outside politics. Now, the emergence of women into the labour force and the effects of that also on men's lives means that some of those divisions between the private sphere and the public sphere, I don't mean public and private sectors, I mean spheres of life, the family, domestic life and the outside life. Some of those barriers are being torn down now. And I can't quite see the outlines of this, but it seems to me there is something that we've already seen quite a lot of what it has to offer, but I just wonder whether there isn't more there, actually. A real two-gender world, public world, might make a society that made certain demands about working life and the balance between working life and domestic life.
Vielleicht sammeln wir jetzt tatsächlich 2 oder 3 Wortmeldungen in eine Gruppe.
Yeah.
If you allow, I would like to put to you 2 questions. The first is with regard to what you call the death of Keynesianism. I have a bit the opposite impression, that the Keynesianism has run wild. When we see, for instance, the euro umbrella, I think this is an expression, if Keynesianism has any sense, of Keynesianism. What has the European Central Bank done till today? They have bought for, this is a figure of today, by more than 200 billion euro state papers. Something which would have been unimaginable still 1 year ago, I think. Or when you think of the recapitalization which was decided on the 27th of October with 109 billion euro. Where does the money come from? If it comes from public sources, this is Keynesianism run wild. So instead of seeing a dead body, I see somebody who is running like a crazy guy around. So this is my first question, what do you think of that? The second is with regard to neoliberalism. One has always to be suspicious when there is the word neo, because neo always means a perversion of what has been formerly. Also, the neo-conservatism was a perversion of the conservatism. So neoliberalism is really a perversion of the liberalism. And you described that. And I think the essence of neoliberalism was deregulation, no regulations idea. But maybe I'm too naive. Today, most people would think that this idea was 100% wrong, that there has to be regulations, that there have to be reasonable rules. I think, so in my mind, neoliberalism is dead. Not Keynesianism is dead, neoliberalism is dead. But what you described as influence of banks and industry and government and so on, I think this is a different question. The neoliberalism as a theory, and hopefully naturally also practice with the deregulation idea, deregulation, and I've read the Greenspan autobiography, An Age of Turbulence. He really believes in that, yes. Incredibly, that the president of a federal bank does not even understand his task. How can he fulfill his task when he even does not understand it? So neoliberalism, I think, and this is also opposite what you have said, as a theory, hopefully, is dead.
Als nächste die Dame in der 8. Reihe. Ja, genau. Nein, 8. Sie sind 6. Die Dame mit den roten Haaren. Ja, genau. Oder ich glaube zumindest, oder dunkelbraun, ich weiß nicht.
So thank you for your wonderful books and your wonderful talk. But what I would like to ask you is a recommendation. When you were talking about this alternative view of the antitrust laws, have you written anything about it yourself, or can you give any literature which describes this development of the law and economics development about antitrust? Thank you.
Gut, und jetzt die Dame mit den blonden Haaren in der 6. Reihe. Naja, das sehe ich hier am ehesten.
I'm especially interested in the strong role of NGOs with which you finish both of your books. And my question refers to getting a better understanding of what this role can exactly be. And I think perhaps that's a key question, how to take things forward. And I think there are two things I would like to understand especially. Do you think it's more the role of NGOs to try to stop this corporate lobbying power on governments? Or do you think the right way forward would be to say, okay, this is how politics works in these days, and what we have to do is to actually use these corporates to do the right lobbying, so to try to turn them around. I regard that actually as a quite key question. The other thing I would like to ask is, I think the strongest movements we have at the moment, besides the strong influence of corporations in general, is the extreme influence of the financial sector and actually how the world is being, in fact, as you described yourself, ruled by the financial sector. And I think a second important factor that you didn't mention is actually corruption. And I think the power of corruption is completely underestimated, and there, in fact, are many countries where corruption is actually the biggest economical factor. And again, with regards to these two questions, what role do you see for NGOs in there? Do you think that NGOs can have any influence on this extremely powerful financial sector? And also, don't you think that NGOs are in fact completely irrelevant with regards to the power that we are actually meeting with these two sectors?
Yeah, that's 3, isn't it? Yes, see, Keynesianism as a proper economic strategy is a way of using government debt strategically and temporarily. And if you look at the moment today, the Scandinavian countries in general have the lowest levels of overall debt. It's not Keynesianism is not about permanent debt. What has been happening in Greece and in Italy in particular has been governments providing services for their population and being unable to get tax revenue out of that population. That's the social compromise there. I mean, you know, there used to be that thing in Eastern Europe, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. But in Southern Europe, it used to be they pretend to provide us with services and we pretend to pay taxes. But now they do get the services, but they're still pretending to pay the taxes. And if you look at, in particular, those two countries, to a lesser extent Spain and Portugal, or lesser extent Spain, certainly, it's the inability of governments to raise taxes to cover their expenditure. Enormous tax evasion by all classes of society, which has become fundamental to how the economy works. It's part of the corruption, actually. Now that's nothing to do with Keynesianism, and the Keynesianism only works when you've got a very efficient state that is spending and taxing, and it's balancing. So yes, it might be Keynesianism run wild, but that is because Keynesianism, okay, it died, has come back as a monster, but it's not actually Keynesianism, and there are people across the political spectrum seem to be getting this wrong. They feel that having big debts, that's Keynesianism, because it rescues the economy. In the Greek case, it doesn't rescue the economy, actually. It simply enables people to go on with this unsustainable model. Yes, the heart of neoliberalism is deregulation, and it's true that area, I would say it's not one of where neoliberalism has been defeated, but I do see it as an area of continual contestation, that there is a process of deregulation and struggles over re-regulation. And although regulation is often a very boring subject and it's difficult to get political excitement about it, it is actually where a lot of very interesting conflicts are worked out. And you could really, if you wanted to see who was powerful in different sectors of the economy, you need to look at the content of regulation. So it's a zone of contestation, I would say. A book on antitrust, yeah, there's a very good book by Giuliano Amato. Now, Amato is an interesting man in that he's been the Prime Minister of Italy a number of times and the Treasury Minister of Italy a number of times. He's a professor of law. The book, I can't remember the name of his book, but I refer to it in my little book a lot, and I've listened. Sorry? That's it. That's it.
Antitrust and the bounds of power.
That's it. He traces this very well, and he understands it both as an academic lawyer and as a politician. Someone also from the heart of the Italian political elite, actually. NGOs, what can their role be? Well, there's a kind of functionalist assumption in the way you put that question that assumes that people have roles that are assigned to them. And one of the wonderful things about civil society is that it refuses to have roles assigned to it. It does what it does because people decide to do it, and some of the things they try to do fail and some succeed and get interesting. So I think the civil society groups are testing out a whole range of different possibilities for action. And certainly one of them is lobbying corporations directly. They will sometimes say that actually they can get more progress that way. That if you want to... The trouble is it only works in certain sectors. And if you want to get a clothing firm to do something about slavery and its supply chains in China and Pakistan, you probably do better to embarrass that firm with its customers, because it's not cool to wear clothes made by slaves. And Nikkei got into big trouble over that a few years ago when they were revealed to be using child labour. And they became very unfashionable for a while, and they've had to pretend, or at least pretend they may even have done something real, to do something about this. So I think civil society groups will try a whole load of different avenues, and they will get various successes and various failures. And it's interesting to watch where they have their successes and failures. And I say, but the problem with lobbying firms directly is you really have to get brand name firms, and in particular in fashion-sensitive sectors.
With a good image.
With a good, who care about a good image, right?
If it's already Goldman Sachs, it doesn't work because
they don't need a good image. Certainly, yes. Can NGOs do anything about corruption? Well, this is where, in a way, the current demand for transparency and the use of the internet to find facts out and to publicize them is proving very, very helpful, actually. Although we probably have no idea how much corruption really goes on,
we are discovering more than we would have done 15 years ago because people are busy working away looking for this stuff. And it has an effect on potentially corrupt firms because they know that this spotlight of publicity might come on them. So it probably has some preventive effect. There's then always the blackest side of all this is, of course, NGOs themselves can be corrupted. They can be bought by firms and can end up there's a wonderful name for them. There was an American politician called them AstroTurf organizations. You know, AstroTurf is artificial grass, right? And you know, the whole point of civil society is what, I don't know if you have the same expression in German. We talk about grassroots organizations. And these are things that are right at the bottom, right? They're coming up, bubbling out of society, the roots of the grass. Well, AstroTurf has no roots and is completely artificial. So beware the AstroTurf civil society groups.
Jetzt haben wir noch 4 Wortmeldungen. Ich würde die sammeln wollen und damit auch dann Schluss machen. Als erstes der Herr mit dem grünen T-Shirt.
Is it on? Okay. My question is regarding the public sector or sector of general interest. You mentioned that the problem with this was that the corporations have the possibility to sign contracts directly with the government or with government officials. But taking that a step further back, the government is accountable to the general public as an electorate. So shouldn't the corporations be responsible to the general public in that sense? And why is that not working at the moment? Thank you.
Jetzt haben als nächstes sich gemeldet wieder eine Dame oder ein Herr in der letzten Reihe. Ich habe nur den Arm gesehen. Ah ja.
I have a question about social entrepreneurship. You talked about corporate social responsibility and you criticized corporations. In English, it's a little better formulated than in German. Der Unternehmer, the entrepreneur, actually, I'm talking about Eigentümerunternehmer, so an entrepreneur who actually owns the business. Yeah, and I think this is very important that the enterprises go back to, or the entrepreneurs owning businesses, but you criticize that small and medium-sized enterprises are not very powerful. In Austria, they make up 80% of our GDP. So the role, I see a very important role, especially with climate change and innovation in social entrepreneurships, and we already see it in India or less developed countries where social entrepreneurship plays a very important role. And why isn't it playing a role in Europe?
So, als nächster der Erhard Stackel in der 3. Reihe.
Thank you. In your book, you're mentioning how neoliberalism has been imposed on Chile as one of the pioneer countries in the world in this field. In recent years, in several Latin American countries, as Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, and others, governments have come to power that are maintaining that they are shrugging off neoliberalism and they are trying something different. Is there truth in this, in your view? And is it possible for an individual country to get out of this system?
Und der letzte in unserer Question-Answer-Runde, Thomas.
I'm not a Marxist, but I do believe that Marx had some worthwhile thoughts. I'm not as wealthy as Soros, but I think he had some relevant thoughts too. And what both men have in common is that they say it's not the issue of whether we have a stronger regulation or the regulation is tilted that way or the other, but the system as such tends towards imbalance. And in this connection, I put it in my question in the form of a proposition. If, as is the case, the interest rates are above the rate of growth of the real economy, then automatically you will have a growth of money. So it's not the demand by consumers which kind of want to buy stuff by taking out mortgages or having credit cards. But this surplus money that desperately tries to find some sort of way, and it pushes into a kind of. I think that you look at America, the credit crisis to a large extent was not only caused by overconsumption, but by people becoming too greedy and wanting this and that stuff. But the banking system pushing money into bubbles of that kind. And the second thing, Soros kind of saying that they're talking about self-reflective systems, kind of. If everybody believes Italy can pay its debts, then the money is there, it exists in form of credit. But if everybody believes it cannot pay, it cannot pay. It's a self-referential system. So it has a mechanism by its own, and this goes far beyond what can be grasped by the tools that you have mentioned. Thank you.
First question was, yes, what is the relationship really between the public and firms that contract to provide public services? This will gradually become an important issue. A colleague of mine who's a lawyer in Oxford has written about this, a man called Mark Friedland. To my knowledge, he's the only person who's really, he saw this about 15 years ago, he started writing about it. It's a very interesting question, that if you are dissatisfied with the school system being provided by a private firm, who do you complain to, and what is your complaint about? Do you blame the local government for giving them the contract, or do you blame the firm, and how do you talk to the firm? It's an important unresolved issue that will have to be addressed, actually. I don't think any political system has addressed it yet. It will probably come first in Sweden, actually, because they've gone so far down this road and their public have such high expectations of services. I expect that's where we'll see some changes. Entrepreneur is actually a French word, and it means exactly the same as Unternehmen. It means someone who takes between. It's very interesting, takes among, very interesting idea. We don't actually have an English word for it. There's only French and German. No, I do not disparage, I do not look down on the role of SMEs. I've written a number of books about the role of SMEs in European economies in certain sectors. I'm quite romantic about them, in fact. It's just that there are major sectors of the economy where they will never be dominant, that we have to accept that things like oil, probably bulk production of food, motor cars, banking, a number of sectors which are often actually troublesome sectors that create social problems. The food industry creates social problems, health problems. A number of sectors, key sectors, are dominated by huge corporations. The world of small and medium-sized enterprises and their initiatives, that goes on. And if you look at the Italian economy today, that one of the things that is going on for them, and where they differ from Greece really, is they still have thriving, entrepreneurial, high-quality firms in a number of sectors. And these are usually small or medium-sized enterprises. And the recovery of the Italian economy will probably depend on them again. So I don't disparage them. I just notice that it would be impossible to try to make something like the oil industry or the mass media SMEs again. It's just sad. I don't know enough about Latin America, I'm afraid. I'm a European specialist, and I try to acquire knowledge of places like Romania now. I used to be a Western European specialist. I've accepted that's not acceptable anymore. So I'm trying to be a European specialist, but I don't do Latin America, so I can't answer the question. And they were very important points you made about surplus money chasing around, actually. The need for us all to keep consuming is quite frightening, really. You eventually just have enough stuff. You don't want any more. Well, more seriously, if you look, because the need for us all to keep spending and the need for surplus money to find a place also has its response in the need for us all to find work. And we know that in many parts of the economy it's increasingly difficult to make work efficiently, partly because of globalization, partly because of increasing productivity. And yet there's a number of sectors of economic activity where demand continues to rise and which isn't dependent on the use of non-renewable resources. And that is the whole care sector, the whole public service sector. We have crises of employment in most of our countries at the moment. We're doing mine, not so much here. But we also have enormous demands for certain sorts of services, which we are unwilling to fund because of our desire to have more money for private consumption. And they're solving this problem by a process of immigration of people who come in to do these jobs at very low wages, because that enables us to afford them. Now, it's probably doing something constructive in providing money that's sometimes sent home to very poor parts of the world, but we are in a position where we have a lot of unmet needs, but we don't know how to meet those needs other than through taxation. We don't like having taxation, and so we insist on having money for consumption, which we spend on things that most of us don't need. That's just another part of the sort of Soros problem.
Thank you, Colin. Colin, ich darf mich nochmal bedanken, dass du wieder hier warst, und nach dem dritten Mal kann man fast schon mit Sicherheit sagen, wir freuen uns, wenn du wieder zu Gast hier sein wirst. Ich bin zuversichtlich, dass das mit dem spätestens mit dem nächsten Buch der Fall sein wird. Ich danke Ihnen, dass Sie alle hier waren. Das nächste Mal sehen wir uns im Rahmen dieser Reihe, ich glaube am 13. Dezember, da haben wir den britischen eigentlich Geographen, aber das ist nicht wirklich sein Hauptgebiet, Daniel Dorling hier. Er ist hat ein ganz hervorragendes Buch über Ungleichheit geschrieben und über die Legitimationsstrategien dazu und welche Gegenlegitimationsstrategien man sich dazu ausdenken kann. Ein Freund und auch, glaube ich, Mitarbeiter von Richard Wilkinson, den wir auch das letzte Mal hier hatten. Also ich bin mir ziemlich sicher, auch das wird ein spannender Abend, und darf Sie alle einladen hierher am 13. Dezember, bevor wir dann ein bisschen in die Weihnachtspause gehen. Danke Ihnen und kommen Sie gut nach Hause.